It's early morning on October 2nd, 2002, somewhere just outside Buena Park, California, and a man named David Montoya is doing what he does every single day, leaving his house before the sun is fully up, getting in his Ford Expedition and making his way to the family trucking business he helped build from the ground up. That's it. That's his whole routine. And it's a routine that by that morning somebody had already been studying for a while. Except this morning, David never makes it inside the building alone, because at some point between leaving his home and opening up the company, he gets ambushed. Armed men force their way into the situation, and before he can fully process what's happening, he's being pushed into a vehicle at gunpoint, surrounded by members of the Pacoima Flats gang, men he's never met, men who have nothing personal against him, men who are only there because someone told them to be. And when David realizes that these men want to take him home, to his house, where his wife Susan and his 3 daughters, ages 7, 9, and 11 are still inside, something shifts in him. He starts feeding them the wrong directions. He steers them away from his street, because whatever happens to him, he is not leading these people to his family. And for a moment, it seems like maybe he can hold it together long enough for something to change. Then a neighbor spots his expedition moving through the neighborhood, tailed closely by a blue Chevrolet Blazer. And a few moments later, near an intersection just half a mile from his home, he makes a decision. He throws himself out of the moving vehicle and tries to run. And that's when Armando pulls out a gun and fires. David collapses in the street, a single gunshot to the head. His expedition rolls nearby, shell casings scattered on the pavement, and when police arrive, they find him lying there. 44 years old, a man who had been working since before most people wake up, a man who had spent his entire adult life building something real, just gone. This wasn't a random robbery. This wasn't a case of wrong place, wrong time. This was ordered. This was planned. And the person who set all of it in motion wasn't some rival, wasn't some enemy from the streets. It was someone who sat across from David at family dinners, someone who knew his schedule, knew where he worked, knew exactly what to tell the men who came to kill him. This was something way deeper than it looked from the outside. To understand how something like this happens, you have to go back, all the way back to the family itself, to a trucking company called Interfreight Transport, based in Rancho Dominguez, California, and to a man named Pete Montoya, who built that company and intended for his children to run it together after him. Pete had 2 kids who were central to the business, his daughter Deborah Perna and his son David Montoya. And on paper, that sounds like a clean family story. Father builds something, passes it down to the next generation, everyone carries the legacy forward. But the reality of how that played out between those 2 siblings is a whole different thing entirely. And the gap between how it looked from the outside and what was actually happening underneath that surface is really where this whole story lives. David was the kind of person who made it hard for anyone to say he hadn't earned what he had. He had lost his right arm at age 13 in a train accident, a disability that, for a lot of people, becomes the thing that defines what they can't do. Not David. He didn't use it as an excuse. He didn't let it shrink his ambitions or give him a reason to stand at the edges of anything. He worked his way through the operational side of the business steadily and seriously, learning every layer of how the company ran, how the freight moved, how the relationships were managed, and over time, he naturally took on more and more of the leadership. He wasn't given that position because he was the favorite or because the deck was stacked in his favor. He built it. He showed up. He handled it. And eventually, he owned 45% of the company. Outside of work, he had a wife, Susan, and 3 daughters. And by all accounts, he was living the kind of quiet, stable life that comes from genuinely putting in the work over a long period of time. The kind of life that from the outside looks easy, but is really just the result of a lot of years of not quitting. His disability seemed to endear him to many clients and employees. It became part of his identity, the man who overcame something significant and inspired others in the process. And that, in a strange and painful way, may have made things worse between him and Deborah. Because in the same company, where David was seen as the one who overcame and inspired, Deborah was seen as the one who handled the administrative tasks and argued with her brother on the warehouse floor. She wasn't wrong that the narrative was unequal, but the answer she landed on for why it was unequal, that David was cheating, that the company was being stolen from her, was completely disconnected from reality. Deborah's path through the same family and the same company looked completely different. She came up alongside David in the late 80s and early 90s, handling the administrative side while he ran operations. But somewhere in that stretch of time, something started to wear on her. She burned out. She got tired of her role, tired of the daily grind of office management, tired of the structure and the weight of it. And after about 5 years of that, she left the company entirely, which at that point might have just been a life decision, something people do when something isn't working anymore. She had her own life to manage. She was a single mother of 3. People walk away from family businesses all the time, and it doesn't automatically mean anything dark. But the problem was, when she came back to Interfreight in the late 90s, David was in charge, and now she was reporting to him. Think about what that actually feels like, coming back to something that was supposed to be shared, supposed to be equal, and finding out that while you were gone, the architecture of the whole thing reorganized around someone else. The company your father built, the place that was supposed to be as much yours as anyone else's. And now you're the one clocking in, answering to a brother you've had friction with your entire life, watching him run the thing that your father's already talking about handing over completely. That's a specific kind of resentment, the kind that doesn't announce itself all at once, but builds quietly over months and years until it becomes the lens through which you see everything. Co-workers described her as hardworking, but also quick to anger. She felt underappreciated and would complain openly that David mismanaged funds. Friends told investigators she referred to her brother as the golden boy and fumed that their father favored him. The resentment she already carried toward her brother only deepened when she found out that Pete, who was thinking about retiring, planned to hand control of the company to David. Not to both of them, to David. According to testimonies at trial, she confided to colleagues that she would never allow David to take everything from her, and she told one friend that her father had spit in my face by choosing her brother. That's not frustration anymore. That's a woman who feels robbed by her own family and who has made the decision, somewhere deep down, that she is owed something back. Instead of sitting with that and finding a way to work through it, Deborah started building a version of the situation in her head that justified everything she was feeling. She convinced herself that David was embezzling money from the company, hiding it in coffee cans in his garage. The rumor had reportedly grown to the point where people were saying he stuffed anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000 in coffee cans behind the water heater in his garage. There was no evidence of that. None. Financial records presented at trial revealed no evidence that David stole from Interfreight. But once she locked onto that idea, it became the story she told herself to explain why things were so unfair, why he had everything and she had less. And the longer she held onto that story, the more real it became to her. That's the thing about a lie you tell yourself long enough. It stops feeling like a lie. It starts feeling like the truth that everyone else is just too blind or too complicit to see. And that belief, that irrational, unverified belief about coffee cans full of stolen cash, would end up being the foundation for everything that followed. Because once Deborah had convinced herself that David was a thief who had taken from the family, the leap toward doing something about it became, in her mind, almost reasonable. That's how people arrive at decisions that look insane from the outside. It's not one giant step, it's 100 small steps, each one feeling justified by the last, until you're somewhere you never would have consciously agreed to go when you started walking. In early 2002, Deborah hired a woman named Idomira Mira Corona to work at Interfreight as an office assistant. And from the very beginning, the way Deborah treated Idomira had less to do with the job and more to do with what she might be able to help her with. Because Idomira had a specific kind of connection that Deborah was paying attention to. Her father, Felipe Vivar, was a high-ranking member of the Mexican mafia prison gang. And Deborah, who by this point had been sitting with her obsession over David for years, had started to move from resentment into something much more deliberate. This wasn't just jealousy anymore. This was calculation. She had found someone who had access to the kind of people she needed. Around May of 2002, Deborah approached Corona and bluntly asked whether she knew anyone who could murder David. Not in a joking way. Not as some vague, frustrated comment you might walk back later. Directly, deliberately. She wanted David dead, and she thought Corona, because of who her father was and what world he moved in, might be the bridge to making that happen. Corona brushed it off at first, hoping the outburst was born of frustration, telling herself maybe Deborah was just venting. But Deborah wasn't done. She kept pushing, and the fact that she kept pushing, that she didn't take the first brush off as a sign to step back, didn't feel the weight of what she was actually asking, tells you something about how far gone she already was at that point. At some point, she made it more concrete. She wrote out a handwritten note with David's home address and phone number and handed it to Corona, asking again whether she could arrange to have her brother killed. On the note, she scribbled the words "one hand," a reference to David's amputated arm, a detail meant to identify him to whoever came. There's something about that detail that matters in a way that's hard to shake, because writing "one hand" is not something you do in a moment of emotional heat. That's operational thinking. You're giving a description. You're making sure the right person gets found. That's not emotion. That's intent. And it's the kind of intent that lives in a person who has already decided, on some level, that this is really going to happen. Corona slipped the note into her desk drawer, unsure what to do, and that note, just sitting there, would eventually become one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the entire case. According to Corona's later testimony, Perna said, "I need David to disappear. I need him taken care of." When Corona responded that she couldn't help, Perna pushed further, adding, "But you know people who can." These words marked the turning point from resentment into active violent conspiracy. She wasn't asking for help managing a conflict, she was soliciting a murder, and she wasn't going to stop until she got someone to say yes. Then, in August, Anthony Navarro visited Interfreight to deliver methamphetamine to Corona, which already tells you what kind of world was beginning to bleed into this family business. And Idamira introduced him to Deborah. And Deborah, looking at this man, his tattoos, the way he carried himself, the clear signal that he was deep in gang life, made a decision. She told Idamira that she should give Anthony the note and ask him to handle the hit on David. When Idamira later mentioned to Anthony that Deborah had seen his tattoos and thought he was the kind of person who could arrange something like this, Anthony laughed, but he didn't walk away. And that's where the line gets crossed, because up to that point, this was one desperate, resentful woman asking around for someone to do something terrible. The moment Anthony Navarro got involved, the whole situation transformed into something with actual structure and actual momentum behind it. It stopped being a fantasy and started being a plan. Anthony Navarro grew up in Pacoima, a neighborhood in the San Fernando Valley notorious for gang activity, and joined the Pacoima Flats gang as a teenager. By the late 1990s, he was both a criminal and a paid informant, someone who dealt methamphetamine while simultaneously feeding information to the FBI, ATF, and Los Angeles police. Law enforcement considered him a shot caller, meaning he supervised younger gang members, ordered crimes, and managed the gang's operations. His double life created a web of secrecy and betrayal that had been building for years before Deborah Perna ever handed that note to Idamira Corona. When he was just 16, he was part of a massive gang shooting involving 25 to 30 other members. 2 rival gang members were killed. Anthony was never proven to have fired a weapon himself, but he was convicted of voluntary manslaughter. Because when you're in the middle of something like that, the law doesn't always draw clean lines between who pulled the trigger and who stood there while it happened. That conviction at 16 years old set the entire trajectory of what followed. A decade after that, in 1995, he robbed a man named Francisco Chavez and his wife at knife point under the pretense of a clothing sale, earning a conviction for second-degree robbery with a weapons enhancement. 2 serious convictions before he was 30, and a reputation in the streets that was built on exactly the kind of violence that made Deborah think he was the right person for the job she needed done. Then came the chapter that would define the rest of his life. In 2000, after the Mexican mafia murdered his cousin, Anthony flipped and became an FBI informant. He worked with the Los Angeles FBI office, then the San Diego office, then the ATF, attending Mexican mafia meetings, wired with a hidden mic and camera, feeding the feds ongoing intelligence about gang activities. The FBI gave him cash, which he passed along to high-ranking Mexican mafia members as so-called rent money, protection payments extorted from gang members, and this elevated his standing within the organization while he was secretly feeding information against it. At one point, he claimed the gang elevated him to Yavo, keyholder, essentially the top man in charge of a section of Pacoima. He had 9 different cell phones, many of which he let other gang members use so he could monitor their conversations and report back. 9 phones, wired meetings, cash flowing in both directions, a leadership title within one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in California, while simultaneously feeding intelligence to federal law enforcement. That is an extraordinarily high-wire act, and it requires someone who is comfortable lying to everybody on every side at the same time. The FBI thought they had a controlled asset. The Mexican mafia thought they had a loyal and rising operator. In reality, Anthony was playing every room he walked into, and like all high-wire acts, it held right up until the moment it didn't. He was arrested for gun possession by a felon, a charge that could have been his 3rd strike under California law, meaning mandatory life in prison. Instead of prosecuting him, they released him on low bail, and the charge vanished because of his informant status. And that was when the rumors started spreading through the gang that Anthony was a snitch. Someone connected the dots, the dropped charges, the access he had, the way certain things kept going sideways for people around him. The FBI had no choice but to cut him loose. And just like that, the protection he had been operating under from both sides evaporated. After that, Anthony feared the gang believed he was pocketing the rent money and had put a green light on him, a gang-sanctioned kill order. He was no longer making the payments that kept him in good standing. He was no longer protected by federal handlers. He was out in the open on both sides, and what followed was a period of escalating, desperate violence that investigators later argued was Anthony trying to rebuild credibility inside the gang the only way left available to him, by doing things that proved he was still dangerous, still loyal, still worth keeping alive. A mechanic named Paul Parent, hired by Anthony in September 2001, was forced to live inside his home just 2 weeks into the job. Months of beatings followed. When Paul tried to leave, Anthony and others broke his finger with a hammer. He tried escaping again a month later, caught, beaten again by Anthony and 4 other men. Anthony eventually dangled an exit, gave Paul a van, told him he could leave if he helped move some furniture first. Paul did the job. 10 minutes later, Anthony called to mock him and told him Rudy was going to shoot him. 2 minutes after that, Paul was shot in the back and spent 6 months in the hospital recovering. A woman named Karenza Spellerman, who had been selling meth to Anthony, was locked in his garage for 2 weeks without food after she couldn't provide information he wanted about a gang rival. Paul eventually helped her escape. This was the man that Deborah's plan had now attached itself to. Not a professional hitman operating at a clean, managed distance, but someone volatile, cornered, and operating with almost no guardrails. Someone trying to survive a kill order from his own gang while maintaining relevance through acts of increasingly extreme violence. And now he had a murder-for-hire job dropped in his lap by a woman he'd met through a meth delivery at a family trucking company. These worlds were never supposed to touch. The fact that they did is entirely on Deborah, because she kept pushing until she found the person who wouldn't say no. Navarro needed muscle to carry out the kidnap, robbery, murder, so he turned to younger gang members who were eager to prove themselves. By recruiting others to do the actual shooting, he minimized his own direct exposure while retaining control over the operation. He supplied them with resources, coordinated communication, and offered them a cut of the cash Deborah had promised was waiting in the garage. It was, in the ugliest possible way, structured like a project, with assigned tasks, provided resources, and an expected outcome. And 3 young men signed up for it because they believed the money was real. By mid-August, the threads were connecting in ways that were becoming impossible to pull back from. Anthony was driving Idamira up to Northern California to visit her father at Pelican Bay State Prison and her boyfriend at a county jail, and during that road trip, Deborah called. When she realized Anthony was in the car, she asked directly whether Idamira had mentioned the plan to have David killed. Anthony immediately asked for David's address. Idamira didn't have the note on her at the time, which slowed things down temporarily, but they arranged to meet again specifically so she could bring it. When she handed it over, she told him that Perna would let him keep any money recovered from the house and that she wanted David to disappear. Anthony responded yes, effectively accepting the job. He took the note and placed it in the glove box of his Lexus. At that moment, there were no more theoretical conversations, no more vague signals passed between people. There was a note with a name, an address, a physical description, and a man who had said yes. Now here's where the story gets complicated in a way that matters, because Anthony did reach out to law enforcement after this. He claimed he tried to report a vague murder-for-hire plot to his ATF handler, but offered no details. Law enforcement told him to get more information and come back. He called LAPD Detective Rod Rodriguez and hinted at a kidnap for ransom or murder-for-hire situation developing. Still no names, no victim, no specifics whatsoever. Rodriguez told him clearly he needed a name at minimum before anything could move. 2 weeks later, Anthony called again, vaguely mentioning Orange County as a possible location. Rodriguez repeated the same ask. Anthony promised to follow up. He never did. What that sequence of calls tells you is that Anthony knew exactly what was being planned. He had the note in his glove box. He had David's address. He had accepted the job. But instead of giving law enforcement enough to actually stop it, he gave them just enough to cover himself later. Information with no name, no victim, no location, and no timeline is not a tip. It is a performance. And no amount of vague phone calls over several weeks was ever going to be enough to save David Montoya. And somewhere Anthony had to have known that. What makes it even harder to sit with is how straightforward Rodriguez's ask actually was. One name, that's all. And Anthony, who had a handwritten note in his glove box with David's home address, written by the woman who ordered the hit, couldn't manage to pass along a single name across multiple calls over multiple weeks. Whether that was self-preservation, deliberate calculation, or just the deep-seated instinct of a man who had been playing both sides of every situation for so long that he didn't know how to fully commit to either anymore. The effect was the same. The clock kept running. David stayed completely unaware, and Deborah kept pressing. In early September, she pressed Corona again. asking when Navarro would act. The urgency in her was building. She had been sitting on this plan since May, had brought in the people she thought could execute it, and she wanted it done. Corona ceased working at Interfreight on September 17th, removing herself from the daily orbit of the business, but by that point the pieces were already locked in place. Deborah's payment was clear. She didn't have cash, but she told the men that David had $50,000 stashed in coffee cans in his garage. All they had to do was take him home, and the money would be theirs. That promise, $50,000 in a garage, was the engine behind everything. Navarro supplied the group with cell phones and the Blazer and coordinated communication between Corona and the gang members throughout the planning process, right up until the morning of October 2nd. Phone records beginning around 11 p.m. on October 1st and continuing through the night showed the 1600 phone repeatedly contacting Macias and Martinez. This was not spontaneous. This was the final coordination of a plan months in the making, and the three men positioned in that blue Blazer before sunrise: Armando Macias, 26, Alberto Martinez, 24, and Gerardo Lopez, just 17 years old, were all operating on the belief that there was $50,000 waiting in a garage, and that all they had to do was collect it. David Montoya left his home at roughly 6 a.m., just as he did every weekday, and headed toward Interfreight. His routine was so consistent, it had made him completely predictable to anyone willing to watch him for a few days. By the time employees arrived at the company that morning, found the doors already unlocked and the lights already on but their boss nowhere to be seen, he had already been taken. The three men had forced him into a vehicle at gunpoint. The plan from there was straightforward: take him home, make him retrieve the money from the coffee cans, and finish what Deborah had put in motion. Except David didn't cooperate with the straightforward version, because the straightforward version ends with his wife and daughters inside that house when these men arrive. Susan and their three daughters were still at home, and David knew that if he led these men to his front door, the danger stopped being just about him. "If I take them there, they're going to kill my whole family," Buena Park Police Sergeant Sean Morgan later recalled him thinking. So he started feeding them wrong directions, deliberately misdirecting them to buy time, driving past his own street, pulling toward an intersection about a half-mile from his house. He may have told the gunman he needed to retrieve a key, or that his wife had already taken the children to school. The exact dialogue is unknown, but whatever he said, he kept them away from his front door, and for a few minutes, that worked. A neighbor spotted his expedition closely tailed by the dark blue Chevrolet Blazer. Then, near that intersection, roughly a half-mile from his home, David made the decision. He flung open the door, bolted from the expedition, and ran toward a line of hedges, shouting for help. He had one arm. He sprinted anyway. Neighbors heard the commotion and looked outside. Several witnessed two men chase him around the SUV. One raised a handgun. Seconds later, shots echoed across the street. Montoya was struck in the head and collapsed near the curb. A motorist named Richard Anaya stopped at the intersection, saw the wounded man and the fleeing Blazer. He followed at a distance and called 911 with a partial plate number. Officers quickly spotted the Blazer on nearby freeways, and a chase began. During the pursuit, the suspects tossed two pistols out the windows, a move intended to put distance between themselves and the murder weapon, but one that instead placed it directly on the shoulder of a California freeway, where investigators would find it within the hour. Eventually, a police cruiser rammed the SUV into a utility pole, and Macias, Martinez, and Lopez were all taken into custody. He is 44 years old. He grew up losing an arm and built a career anyway. He worked his way to nearly half of a family company. He left his house before sunrise every single morning to go open a building and keep something alive that his father had spent his entire life creating. And he died in the street, half a mile from his house, trying to keep his kids safe from the people his own sister had sent. The evidence trail started coming together almost immediately after those arrests. And when you lay it all out side by side, the volume of it is staggering. None of it was buried. None of it required sophisticated detective work to uncover. It was all right there, in wallets and glove boxes and phone records, sitting completely in the open. Two pistols thrown from the Blazer were recovered and matched to bullet casings at the scene. One was identified as the murder weapon. But beyond the guns, Macias threw a cell phone into bushes during his arrest. It was registered to Navarro's girlfriend. Phone records showed that phone made 18 calls to Navarro's number in the hour and a half surrounding the murder. One suspect had a piece of paper with Anthony Navarro and a membership number in his wallet. Another had a business card with Navarro's gang moniker written on it. Corona had called Macias 4 times around 6:30 that morning. One call lasted about a minute, connecting just before David was shot. The phone number ending in 1600 showed near constant contact in the hours leading up to the murder between Corona, Navarro's wife, his girlfriend Macias, and Martinez. Macias had rented a separate car the day before and left it parked outside Navarro's house. The Blazer used in the killing was registered at Navarro's girlfriend's address, and Navarro's wife called police at 9 a.m. to report it stolen, hours after it had already been impounded following the chase. The keys were still in the ignition. No sign of forced entry. It was not a carjacking, and no one was pretending otherwise. 2 weeks after the murder, police pulled Navarro over in his Lexus. In the glove compartment, they found the handwritten note with David's address and phone number, with one hand written at the top. Alongside it was a CD case containing a photograph of Edelmira Corona. Investigators compared the paper to Interfreight stationery and concluded it came from the office's supply. Forensic handwriting experts matched the handwriting to samples from Perna's desk. A note that had traveled from Deborah's desk to Edelmira's drawer to a gang member's glove box, surviving every single transfer, had become the most direct piece of evidence connecting this murder back to the woman who ordered it. Detectives confronted Corona, faced with the full picture: the note, the photo, the phone records, her own calls the morning of the murder. She admitted that Perna had asked her to arrange the murder and agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. As part of that cooperation, she made a controlled recorded phone call to Deborah Perna. On that call, Corona told Perna that Navarro had been arrested and that police had found the note, and asked what she should say. Perna replied sharply, "Shut up, don't talk to me, keep quiet, don't say anything. I'm not discussing this over the phone." She didn't ask what note Corona was referring to. She didn't express any confusion or surprise. She immediately understood and tried to cut off communication entirely. Detectives later described it as the moment that sealed her fate, because innocent people ask what note you're talking about. Guilty people tell you to shut up. Authorities arrested Deborah Perna on October 19, 2002. A search of her home and office uncovered handwriting samples matching the note. Investigators also found that she had called Corona repeatedly in the months leading up to the murder, asking if Navarro was going to do it and complaining when she heard nothing back. She had already told one co-worker after David's death that it was good riddance because he had stolen from the family, directly contradicting the grief she had performed when police first arrived. At trial, Senior Deputy District Attorney Dan Wagner built the prosecution's case around a narrative of jealousy and greed, calling witnesses who testified to her hatred of David, playing the recorded phone call, introducing the note, and arguing that her pattern of behavior from the very first ask in May all the way through her last follow-up call before the murder constituted deliberate, premeditated conspiracy. The defense tried to paint Corona as the true architect, arguing that her father's Mexican mafia ties made her the more dangerous figure and that Perna had simply been venting. The jury didn't buy it. The note was in Perna's handwriting. The calls were documented, and the recorded phone call left no room for any other interpretation. At his own separate trial, Navarro admitted receiving the note but claimed he intended to report the plot to police, a claim that directly contradicted phone records showing he coordinated the killers the night before and the morning of the murder. Forensic handwriting experts, phone records, gang expert testimony from Buena Park detective Nathaniel Booth, and the chain of physical evidence recovered from the shooters left no version of events in which Navarro was a bystander or an attempted whistleblower. He had the note. He gave the resources. He made the calls. He accepted the job. Here is where everything comes apart in the saddest possible way. The coffee cans, the $50,000 Deborah told the gang was sitting in David's garage, the entire financial incentive that moved 3 young men to show up before sunrise on a Wednesday never existed. No significant cash was ever found. It was a rumor that gained traction among disgruntled employees and fueled Perna's jealousy. The embezzlement story was something Deborah had constructed entirely in her own mind, nurtured over years and eventually weaponized, used as the currency with which she purchased her brother's death. And the people she paid with it walked away from a garage with nothing because there was nothing there to find. 3 men agreed to kidnap and kill a 44-year-old man they had never met, on the promise of money that didn't exist, arranged by a woman who had convinced herself of an injustice that never happened. The entire architecture of this murder was built on a lie. Deborah told herself so many times it calcified into something she treated as fact. And David Montoya, who was genuinely just a man running a company and raising a family, died because of it. Not because of anything he actually did, because of a story someone else invented about him and refused to let go of. Interfreight soon shuddered under debt and dysfunction, an ironic casualty of the very greed that fueled the crime in the first place. The company Pete Montoya had spent his life building, the thing his son had poured himself into and was set to formally take over, could not survive what Deborah had set in motion. Everything Pete had built as a legacy, everything David had earned his stake in, gone. And Pete and his son Darren continued to believe that Deborah was wrongfully convicted, that Corona had framed her, that the woman they knew couldn't have done this. David's widow believed otherwise and refused to speak to Deborah again. The family fractured not just from the murder itself, but from the irreconcilable versions of the truth that different members chose to hold. And that fracture, in a way, is the final thing Deborah's plan destroyed. Not just a brother, not just a business, but the family that was supposed to outlast all of it. The outcomes. On October 28, 2005, the jury convicted Deborah Perna of conspiracy to commit murder, first-degree murder, and the special circumstance of murder for financial gain. Because a special circumstance was found true, she faced death or life without parole. The prosecution did not seek the death penalty against her, and Judge Richard Toohey sentenced her to life without the possibility of parole on February 16, 2006. Armando Macias, Alberto Martinez, and Anthony Navarro were sentenced to death. Gerardo Lopez received life without parole because he was a minor at the time, though California's changing juvenile sentencing laws eventually reduced that significantly, and he was ultimately released on juvenile probation, a 17-year-old who participated in a murder walking out with his life intact while David's daughters grew up without their father. Edelmira Corona was sentenced in January 2012 to 14 years in state prison for manslaughter. The case remains one of the few in Orange County history to produce 3 death sentences. Appellate courts affirmed Perna's conviction, noting that the note, the recorded call, and Corona's testimony constituted overwhelming evidence. Every appeal failed, every argument that she was venting, that Corona framed her, that the note meant something else, collapsed under the weight of what she had actually said and done, documented and recorded and preserved. She is serving her sentence at the California Institution for Women in Frontera. No release date, no parole hearings, the rest of her life in a cell for ordering the death of her own brother, a brother who had done nothing to her except succeed at the same business she had walked away from and carry more of it than she was willing to carry herself. And that is what stays with you, long after the case files close and the verdicts are read and everyone moves on. Not the gang world, not the informant history, not the chase through Orange County. It is the smallness of the original thing, the resentment that started it, the story she told herself about coffee cans, the fact that she sat across from this man at family events, watched him work, watched him raise 3 daughters, watched him build something real with one arm, and decided the answer was a handwritten note passed through a meth connection to a gang shot caller. The fact that by the time the lies she had constructed came apart completely, by the time it was undeniably clear that there were no coffee cans, no $50,000, no secret proof of anything, her brother was already gone, her father's company was already done, and the only thing left of the plan she had spent months building was a piece of paper in a police evidence bag with her own handwriting on it, and a phone call she could never take back. Family is supposed to be the one thing that holds even when everything else doesn't. And what this case shows is that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who already knows your address and has known it their whole life.